Something happened in the Coachella Valley this week that nobody in the 53-year history of the BNP Paribas Open had a script for. The ticket markets broke first, then the merchandise stands collapsed. Then the practice courts became spectator events. Then the hotels filled with travelers who had never previously booked a room for the opening rounds of a tennis tournament in their lives. And all of it, every last piece of this extraordinary and completely unprecedented chaos, traces back to a single 20-year-old left-hander from Manila who walked into the California desert as a seeded player for the first time in her career and immediately rewrote every rule the tournament thought it understood about how these things are supposed to work. Her name is Alex Eala. She is ranked 32nd in the world. She is the first Filipino athlete in history to enter a WTA 1000 event with a seeded position. And what she has done to Indian Wells before hitting a single competitive ball in the main draw is something the people who have been running this tournament for decades are still trying to fully process. Not just the fans, not just the media, the tournament directors, the security coordinators, the merchandise managers, the hotel operators across the entire Coachella Valley, and the corporate boardrooms of some of the biggest sports brands on the planet have all been sent scrambling by the arrival of one person in the California desert. And it is only getting started. Let us begin at the beginning, because the beginning tells you everything about the scale of what is happening here. Before the draw was announced, before the main draw had even taken shape, before a single first-round qualifying match had been completed, the secondary ticket markets were already registering something extraordinary. On a standard year, a general stadium pass for the opening rounds of the BNP Paribas Open costs somewhere between $60 and $80. Manageable, predictable, the kind of number that feels appropriate for a weekday session at a WTA event, even a prestigious one. This year, the moment word spread that Alex Eala had secured her seeded position and would be making her Indian Wells debut, the resale platforms told a completely different story. Sessions featuring the Filipina were listing for $400 at the low end before the tournament had officially gotten underway. Midsection seats were pushing $600. Courtside rows were crossing $1,000 before noon on a Monday. Those are not opening round prices. Those are not even quarterfinal prices for most events on the WTA calendar. Those are Grand Slam final weekend prices. The kind of numbers you see when history is about to be made, and the people who have been paying attention know it. The reason those numbers make complete sense when you understand the context is California itself. The state of California is home to the largest Filipino population anywhere in the United States, sitting at just under 2 million people. The Filipino diaspora in California is one of the most tightly connected, culturally proud, and passionately organized overseas communities on the planet. They have been watching Alex Eala's rise for months, from her historic Miami Open semifinal run last year, when she arrived as a wildcard ranked far outside the top 100 and systematically dismantled Grand Slam champion after Grand Slam champion on her way to the last four, to her 2025 US Open win over a top 10 seed that made her the first Filipino in history to win a main draw match at a Grand Slam, to her SE Games gold medal in Thailand, to her quarterfinal runs in Abu Dhabi and Dubai in the early weeks of 2026, where she knocked out the world number 7 Jasmine Paolini and announced herself as a legitimate threat on the biggest stages of the women's game. Every match had been watched, every result had been celebrated, every step closer to the top of the world had been tracked and shared and talked about across every platform and in every Filipino household in the state of California. And when the seedings were announced and Alex Eala's name appeared in that top 32, the question for the Filipino community in California was never whether to go. It was only what price they were willing to pay. The answer turned out to be any price. Season ticket holders who had attended this tournament for 20 years walked through those gates and found a Coachella Valley they did not recognize. The car parks were roaring before the gates opened. Fans in blue and yellow and red were everywhere, organized, loud, proud, already chanting in Tagalog before the qualifying rounds had finished their business. The energy before Alex Eala had played a single point was already unlike anything this desert had absorbed in modern memory. And then she stepped onto court free for a morning practice session, and things escalated dramatically. Security teams had been doubled in anticipation of the crowds around her practice sessions. It barely held. The scenes that emerged on social media from that court were astonishing. Fans pressing against every available vantage point, climbing over each other just to catch a glimpse of that distinctive left-handed forehand snapping through the dry desert air. The Nike Sampaguita gear, the national flower of the Philippines, stitched into every piece of her kit, visible in flashes through the crowd. The atmosphere at a practice session, before a competitive match had been played, before the main draw had properly begun, was generating the kind of electricity that most tournament finals do not produce. The Manila Times described it simply and accurately. Eala mania had arrived in California, and it had not arrived alone. It had arrived with a story that starts, as the best ones always do, somewhere far away, and long before any camera was pointed at it. Before any of this, before Indian Wells and the ticket markets and the Nike portraits and the seedings, there was a 13-year-old girl who packed her bags in Quezon City and flew to Manacor, Spain, to enroll at the Rafa Nadal Academy. Her mother, Riza Maniego Eala, had been a competitive swimmer who won a bronze medal at the 1985 Southeast Asian Games. Her father, Mike, was a businessman. They understood what discipline looked like, what sacrifice meant, what it cost to commit to something completely. And their daughter had already made her decision. She was going to Spain. She was going to train at one of the most demanding tennis facilities in the world. She was going to miss home and miss her friends and miss everything comfortable and familiar about her life. And she was going to do it because the dream was bigger than the comfort, and she understood that distinction clearly at 13 years old. She won the Australian Open junior doubles title in 2020 at 14. She won the Roland Garros junior doubles title in 2021. She won the US Open junior singles title in 2022 and became the first Filipino in history to win a major junior singles crown. And then, as happens with almost every prodigy who attempts the transition from junior tennis to the professional WTA tour, the hard years came, the years when the rankings do not immediately reflect the talent. When you lose matches you feel you should win. When you work and grind and improve, and the results are still not yet consistent enough to break through into the conversations that matter. She spent those years doing exactly what the process demands: building, learning, absorbing the education that only professional courts can provide. She ended 2024 ranked 147th in the world. And then Miami happened. She entered the 2025 Miami Open as a wildcard. She beat Jelena Ostapenko, the 2017 French Open champion. She beat Madison Keys, the 2025 Australian Open champion, ranked 5th in the world. She beat Iga Swiatek, the number 2 player on the planet, back-to-back-to-back. 3 Grand Slam champions or top 5 players eliminated by a wildcard ranked 140th. She made the semi-finals as a player who had no business being in the draw on paper and every reason to be there in practice. The first Filipino to reach a WTA 1000 event semi-final. The first Filipino to beat a top 5 player. The first Filipino to break into the WTA top 100 in the world, all in 2 weeks, in Miami. And the moment the scoreboard confirmed that run, California started preparing. She went on to end 2025 ranked 50th in the world. She began 2026 by reaching the semi-finals in Auckland, the quarterfinals in Abu Dhabi, and the quarterfinals in Dubai. Her win over world number 7 Jasmine Palini in Dubai was a tactical masterclass, her left-handed topspin creating angles and difficulties that the Italian simply could not solve, a preview of what her game looks like when everything is operating at its sharpest. She lost to Coco Gauff in the quarterfinals, 6-love 6-2, a scoreline that felt harsher than the match itself, and one that she and her team have clearly been dissecting in the weeks since, with the focused intensity of people who understand that losing to the world's best is only a problem if you do not learn from it. She ended that Dubai run and posted on Instagram with the words that 3 weeks of fighting with love and pride has come to an end. The competition, the atmosphere, the hospitality, and the full-blown support has made these weeks ones I'll never forget. Asterisk, asterisk. And then she added something that someone had said to her that had clearly stayed with her. Sabrina Santamaria once said, "It's a privilege to play in front of people who see themselves in you." I couldn't agree more. What a privilege it is to do what you love, with love. Those words matter, because they reveal the emotional foundation underneath everything Alex Eala does. She is not playing for rankings. She is not playing for prize money. She is playing because she represents something larger than herself, and she knows it, and she cherishes it, and she channels it into every single point she plays. She is playing for everyone who sees themselves in her story. And in California, almost 2 million Filipinos see themselves in her story. On every continent where Filipinos live and work, which is essentially every continent on Earth, people see themselves in her story. And that is a force that no tennis federation, no marketing team, and no seedings committee can manufacture. It either exists or it does not. With Alex Eala, it exists in quantities that have now physically broken the infrastructure of one of the most prestigious tennis events in the world. Before she drove south to Palm Springs, she made a stop that the tennis world watched with considerable interest. The Nike World Headquarters in Beaverton, Oregon. The public framing was straightforward. A global ambassador visiting her sponsor between tournaments. The kind of appearance that fills an afternoon on the calendar. But what was actually happening inside those corridors was something significantly more meaningful than a photo opportunity. Nike welcomed Alexandra Eala with a hero's reception. Lining the hallways of the campus, placed among the portraits of the greatest athletes the brand has ever worked with across all sports, were new displays celebrating her career milestones. Her Miami Open semi-final moment was enshrined on those walls alongside her wins over world-class opponents. One photograph captured her in the tunnel alongside Filipino fans who had traveled to see her play, the image chosen specifically to represent her connection to the diaspora, to the community, to the people who show up everywhere she goes because she carries something that belongs to all of them. Nike did not put up those portraits for a player they see as a peripheral figure. They do not renovate hallways that are reserved for icons for someone they plan to forget in 2 years. What Nike is doing with Alexandra Eala is what Nike does when they believe they have found the next defining face of their brand in a global sport. They are building the narrative carefully and ambitiously, embedding her Filipino identity into every piece of her visual presence, the sampaguita flower in the kit, the cultural pride woven into the storytelling, because they understand that 100 million Filipinos around the world represent one of the most significant untapped markets in global sports commerce. and Nike got there early. She posed for photographs. She held up the Sampaguita-themed Air Riff sandals. She stood in front of her own portrait in the hallway of the greatest athletes in the world, with her hands on her face, mirroring the photograph of the moment she reached the Miami Open semifinals for the first time, visibly overwhelmed, visibly moved, and then she got in a car and drove to California. The draw was released on Monday, and when the tennis world looked at where Alex Eala had been placed in the bracket, there was a collective sharp intake of breath that traveled through broadcast booths and analytical circles and tennis fan forums simultaneously. She is in the top half of the draw, the same quarter as world number 1, Aryna Sabalenka. Her projected path after beating her round of 64 opponent, who will be either Diana Yastremska, the world number 4, who beat her in Dubai just 2 weeks ago. If both players advance as expected, that rematch in the California desert will be the most anticipated match of the entire tournament up to that point. Gauff is a 2019 US Open champion and one of the most complete players on tour. She schooled Eala 6-love, 6-2 in Dubai. What happens when they meet again on a surface and in conditions that favor Eala's style considerably more will tell the tennis world a great deal about how far and how fast this rise is continuing. And the draw analysis from tennis majors described the bracket with language that is already being shared widely across tennis social media. They called it a potential gauntlet. They noted that Gauff herself faces one of the most intriguing paths in the tournament, with Bianca Andreescu waiting as a potential wildcard second-round opponent before a looming third-round clash with Eala. Analysts at Lineups described Eala as one of the top threats to Gauff's path through her half of the draw, naming her alongside Diana Schneider and Linda Noskova as the players most capable of derailing the projected script. For a 32nd seed to be described as a top threat to the path of the world's fourth-best player is not standard language. It is the language of a bracket in which the conventional logic of seedings is already being overtaken by the reality of what one particular player's game and momentum demand. The surface conditions at Indian Wells add another dimension that the analysts have been discussing with real interest this week. The desert air in the Coachella Valley is dry and thin, sitting at roughly 200 meters of elevation above sea level, and the hard courts there play differently from the heavy, slow hard courts of Melbourne or the faster surfaces of Dubai. The ball moves through the air differently. It bounces with a quality that rewards topspin and patience and tactical variation over pure flat power. These are not Aryna Sabalenka's natural conditions. Sabalenka is one of the most powerful ball strikers in the history of the women's game, but her flat, direct game style has historically had occasional complications at Indian Wells, precisely because the surface does not always cooperate with the kind of pace she generates. The conditions at Indian Wells specifically favor the left-handed topspin game that Alex Eala developed and refined at the Rafa Nadal Academy, a facility built on exactly this kind of ball-striking philosophy. Sam Querrey, who called Eala the biggest draw in the WTA on the Nothing Major podcast last week, has been involved in conversations this week about how her technical game maps onto the Indian Wells conditions, and the assessment being shared in tennis circles is consistent and pointed. On this surface in this air, against players whose game relies on pace rather than spin, Eala's left-handed topspin is a structural problem that requires specific and specialized counter-adjustments to manage. The players she would face in deep rounds of this tournament will have done their homework. They always do. But knowing what the weapon does and stopping it in real time under tournament pressure in front of the loudest crowd in the building are two very different tasks. Because the crowd that is going to be inside Stadium 1 at Indian Wells when Alexandra Eala plays is something that the players across the draw have already acknowledged privately and publicly. Jessica Pegula, who faced her in Miami last year, said you could hear the crowd roaring from the hotel. Not from outside the stadium, from the hotel building, across a car park and through walls. That is the volume level being generated by Alex Eala's fanbase when she plays at a major event. Sam Querrey described the scenes in Doha last week as standing room only and said the crowds around her matches have been insane and massive and growing with every single tournament. John Isner agreed immediately. Steve Johnson described the atmosphere as electric and said you want to tune into her matches just to experience what it is like inside the building when she is playing. Former champion Alison Riske-Amritraj compared her fanbase to Taylor Swift, then turned serious and said the only comparable precedent she could find in sports was Manny Pacquiao at the absolute peak of his powers, the 8-division boxing world champion who made the Philippines stop entirely every time he fought. Riske-Amritraj was clear that she is not being hyperbolic. She is describing what the data and the scenes and the crowds are showing her. I think the ceiling that Alex Eala has is obviously that much higher, she said. And the implication hanging in the air after that sentence is that the ceiling she is describing is essentially unlimited. Novak Djokovic, the greatest tennis player in the history of the sport, added his voice to the conversation during the week. He called Eala the greatest Filipino tennis player who has ever lived and spoke directly about the scheduling and court assignment questions that have been circulating in tennis circles, where observers have argued that some tournaments have placed her on courts too small for the audiences she draws. Djokovic was measured but clear. She is coming from a country where there is big interest, where she is the biggest name in the history of the sport, and the tournament infrastructure needs to reflect that reality properly. When the greatest of all time says a player deserves a bigger stage, the conversations in tournament director offices change. At Indian Wells itself, the tournament has already been forced to make decisions about her scheduling that reflect the unprecedented scale of the demand. Her practice sessions have been drawing crowds that required doubled security details, and the images coming out of court 3 this week look like scenes from outside a concert venue rather than a morning hitting session. She was seen working with world number 20 Diana Schneider and world number 15 Madison Keys in the days leading up to her main draw debut, preparation that signals the level of opponent she is sharpening herself against and the seriousness with which she and her team are approaching this tournament. She is not here to make a respectable showing. She is not here to build experience and move on quietly. She is here, on the best surface for her game, in front of the largest Filipino support base of any location in the world, with the technical tools and the momentum and the confidence of a player who has been winning at this level all year,